She will be speaking on improving and upgrading autos and shared tempos.
Thank you, sir, and good afternoon, everybody. So the subject that I'll be speaking on, I think the chair has already set the context for the presentation, and it is much aligned on those lines, which is where I would want to talk about the important role that intermediate public transport modes, or we even call them informal public transport modes or paratransit modes, are making, in terms of providing mobility services. What are the challenges, issues, what are their key characteristics, and therefore what do we need to improve them? So the presentation is actually based out of a study that we at the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI, New Delhi, had carried out. It was basically, what we understood is that, as was rightly pointed out earlier, that public transport systems do not exist in most of our cities. It's really these paratransit modes or informal modes of mobility that are really providing the mobility services. But we realize that we hardly know about these modes. We really don't know how they operate, what are their operational characteristics, what are the challenges, what are the problems, what are the perceptions of the commuters who use it. And that's how the study was based. And it was actually, just a little bit about the study, it was supported by DFID funding. And the main objective of the study was to understand the role and contribution informal public transport modes were making to meet the mobility needs of population in Indian cities. What are the key issues that are associated with their operations, and what are the likely solutions? So to begin with, as we're using different terms, but all are largely pointing towards the same modes. So there is really no definition of what's intermediate paratransit or paratransit informal mode. So, for example, World Bank defines it as informal public transport is publicly available passenger transport service that is outside the traditional public transport regulatory system. So, in absence of a proper term, we kind of, use these kind of key characteristics to say what really intermediate public transport or informal transport modes are, which is essentially based on criteria like who's providing the service, who's regulating the service, is the service even being regulated or not, what does that transport service do. So based on which we really, can come to this pool of modes which we can really put under this very broad category of informal public transport systems that are existing in our cities. These could be, high capacity four-wheeler minibuses to medium capacity Tata Magics or Geos or other, or these low capacity three-wheel motorized auto rickshaws to even the pedal powered cycle rickshaws, and now, as was said, e-rickshaws, motorcycle taxis. So all of this could come under the ambit of intermediate paratransit or informal public transport that is really existing in our cities. So to kind of understand these modes better, we have studied 5 cities, all of which kind of gave us a kind of a mix of different kinds of modes that are existing, like the formal modes like city bus service, metro rail, and the informal modes like a minibus, Tata Magic, or shared auto rickshaw, cruisers, jeeps, so all sorts. The cities that we studied were essentially Amritsar, Jaipur, Noida, Ahmedabad, Gandhinagar, Sanand, and Virangam. And also within these cities, different kinds of settings, because the urban characteristics of the modes within the city is very different from the modes that are applying on peri-urban areas. So we kind of tried to capture, the idea was to essentially understand these modes fully, understand the issues related to them, and therefore suggest strategies of improving them. So this is essentially in these 5 cities that we studied. These are the kind of modes that we studied, starting from shared auto rickshaw, Tata Magics, minibuses, cruisers, jeeps, chakras, kadukas in Amritsar. So all of that we had studied. And the essentially work was based on extensive field research, because there is hardly much data in the public domain on these modes. Even getting an idea of the numbers of these vehicles that are plying in our cities is a challenge. What we get even from registration numbers is really not a depiction of the real numbers that may be operating on the roads. Carried out wide consultations with different kinds of stakeholders, including government officials, RTO, unions of these people, even the consumers, the commuters. We carried out several surveys and discussions with them. And as I said, the challenges was essentially the limited availability of data. So just coming on to the findings of this study in these 5 cities of these different kinds of modes in different urban settings. So I just want to start with the basic. What is their role? How do these modes emerge? They're emerging essentially because there is a huge transport demand supply mismatch and we really do not have adequate formal public transport systems as we understand them traditionally. So these modes are really emerging to meet this unmet mobility demand, and they are characterized by their operational flexibility, because of which they are able to respond very quickly to the changing demands and thus provide service as it is required, and hence they become popular very soon. And this is what really gives them, all this flexibility is what gives them edge over formal systems. So they could, act as a main mode of transport, say in a smaller city or in a peri-urban area. They could act as a feeder mode to a main trunk line of public transport. They may be just a gap filler, provide intercity connectivity, or even peri-urban connectivity. So they're playing various kind of roles. So there is no one role that one can say that they are always a feeder or they are always a main mode. They're performing different kinds of roles in different kinds of urban settings. And just to kind of give you an example beyond their role, also to the contribution that these modes are making towards meeting the mobility needs of the population. For example, their share in vehicle registration versus the modal share. For example, Jaipur, buses and auto rickshaw together, registered population of these will be just 2% of the total vehicles registered in the city. But together they are meeting the needs of about 25% of the population. That is 25% of the trips in the city are being really catered by these modes. Similarly, in Amritsar, 2% registration in the vehicular fleet versus a 22% kind of share in the trip, modal share in the trips that are made in the city. And even in some cities, they are the only way people can travel. For example, Noida, just on outskirts of Delhi, there is no formal public transport system, no city bus service. There is a metro line, but it's largely for Delhi-Noida kind of a connectivity. So there are about 3,000 shared auto rickshaws and about 4,500 personal auto rickshaws. Auto rickshaws that kind of provide personal or hired mobility services, and no public transport. So they're really playing the role of the main public transit system in a setting even like Noida, not to talk about other smaller cities. And in peri-urban and rural areas, due to complete lack of public transport availability, they fill the mobility gap of that peri-urban connectivity. And here, largely, a lot of these indigenous modes, locally made modes like kadukas in Amritsar or chakras in Gujarat, they are found. So, and what are these types of vehicles? Because that's also very important. There is no, in intermediate paratransit, even the types of vehicles that are used it's quite a range, from formal to retrofitted to locally manufactured modes. Urban areas, typically there'll be more formal vehicles as compared to formal vehicles as in manufactured by the known manufacturers like a Bajaj or a TVS kind of or a Tata. But when you go on to peri-urban areas, we start finding these locally manufactured vehicles that are more prevalent in the peri-urban areas. So, for example, this is just, and in the formal also, we slowly start seeing that, as you go towards the city peripheries, they start getting retrofitted because, if I have an auto rickshaw, I'll add a plank, I'll make 3 more people sit on it. I'll make several retrofitting just to kind of ensure that I have more ridership per trip that I'm making. So, these are some of the formal modes like a Jeep or a Magic, but all were retrofitted in some way or the other to capture more commuters in every trip. And then there are the locally manufactured modes like, just talked about chakras, kadukas. Kaduka, for example, is just an irrigation pump motor, and then it has a trailer attached to it, some bricks and some wooden planks. That's really what the vehicle is. So these are the kind of vehicles that are plying in urban and peri-urban settings and really meeting the mobility needs of the population. For example, when we went to Amritsar, what we found is that under JNNURM, in the previous session, we were talking about, competition from formal, from these informal modes of mobility that already exist, to this new city bus services. So the city had acquired about 40 new buses under the JNNURM and literally no ridership. They're just not getting the ridership. And where is the ridership? It's still on shared auto rickshaws, which are really, I wouldn't say, they're not, probably the city bus service is really not what the city needs. We need to learn lessons from the way these modes are operating, the flexibility that they offer, the routes that they decide to, operate on. So a lot is to be learned from their operational characteristics, which is what we try to do in terms of, these different characteristics to understand. So, types of services that these modes are offering. It could be on personal hire service. It could be shared service, typically, operating on fixed routes, and also services in the peri-urban areas that could be there. And route and zone of operation, it's usually guided by the permits that they are given by the regional transport offices. However, what we find is large-scale violations in these permit regulations. For example, the typical violation is that a contract carriage service, of vehicle would actually start operating as a shared service, and it will start operating outside the permitted zone of operation. And a stage carriage would infringe upon other routes, than the one that is being permitted. And what is the reason for these violations? Essentially that the cost of permit, it's, varies from route to route. So I will take probably permit for one route and then start applying on the other one, which I may find to be more profitable or where the demand is. So essentially the main motive is to maximize my revenue generation. And therefore, I would want to, go beyond my permit zone or the route to cater or to be on the high demand route or zone. So we found a high degree of non-compliance as far as permit regulations were concerned. Then what are the kind of route lengths that these services are making? Usually intra-city, modes, the route sizes are linked to the corresponding city sizes. And in the peri-urban areas, these are lower for the indigenous modes like the chakradas or the karukas, but they're higher for formal modes like which, typically are providing the intercity connectivity. Like we were studying here in Ahmedabad, Gandhinagar connectivity. So a lot of these cruisers or jeeps that they provide. So 25 kilometers kind of in a one-way trip that is being served. So a large variation in trip lengths, again based on where they are, what kind of city setting, what kind of service that they are providing. So a huge variation. The idea was to understand, one cannot characterize them just based on saying they're all this category of intermediate paratransit, so they all behave like that. That is not really the case. They're all behaving very differently, operating with very different kinds of vehicles, with very, very different, even trip lengths that they perform, even the scheduling that they would follow. So interestingly, they follow kind of a discipline and usually a queue system that is being followed in all the cities. And just, and then on the fare setting, usually it is fixed by the RTO. For example, in the on personal hire services case, like in all the cases in auto rickshaw, we usually found it to be, the fares being fixed by the RTOs. However, again, compliance is not there. The auto rickshaw would tend to charge you much higher than what is the kind of fare limit. And typically that was the case. However, we also found that in case of shared services, a lot of times the unions really were deciding the fare. So they were coming together and deciding that on this particular route from point A to point B, this is together what we agree is what we will charge to the commuters. And all of this, are enabling them to make profit. So the motive is essentially, whether it's non-compliance of the set fares or coming together and agreeing to a fare is essentially always profit maximization. So I'll just skip this. So that kind of brings us to, this profit maximization motive brings us to the important thing about, capacity utilization. So which is essentially, passenger kilometer that is being performed per seat kilometer. In all the cases, we found the ratio to be more than 1. So, which essentially is indicating a very high utilization rate and demand for these systems. So they are able to, give far more passenger kilometer as compared to the seat kilometer that they are performing, which essentially kind of brings them to earn more revenue, which is why they can sustain. Now, compare this with the formal system. This is where, the kind of gaps we start seeing that, per seat kilometer, what is really the PKM that I'm able to get. Then we also studied the business models really, these systems are there, they are serving the needs of population, and they're able to kind of continue providing services. And on the other hand, for the formal systems, we are also always complaining about the operational losses. So we try to understand what is the business model, how they are really able to maintain or continue providing services. So vehicles are being operated either by the owners themselves, or they employ somebody or give it on rent, a net cost model or a gross cost model. And typically in driven on rent, it's a net cost model, and it was found to be the most popular across all the cities, in which, essentially the owner pays for the major maintenance. He would rent out the vehicle, and there is a fixed rent for it, and then driver is making money from the fare box revenue. And this is where, the issue of capacity utilization, either way, overloading also comes. And the typical rents we found, being charged for different kinds of mode varied from, 300 rupees to 1,000 rupees. And they all depended on the vehicle condition, vehicle age, what is the route permit where the board is applying. And this is really what we could kind of, capture from all these cities in terms of revenue that they were really making. So earning per kilometer versus cost per kilometer. And largely, what we find is that they were operating in profit. Again, unlike most of our city bus services. And in most of these cases, the ratio of EPK to cost per kilometer, it was found to be higher than 1, except just a few cases, especially in the peri-urban areas. And then as I said, we were talking to different people. We thought it's also important that we have this perception that these modes are really not good. But let's talk to the people who are using it and what they feel about it. So, then we kind of designed these surveys to understand the common perception of the commuters, say for comfort and convenience and safety. And largely, we found the perception to be positive, which kind of indicated a high level user satisfaction. But it could also be the case that you really do not have a choice. So whatever is available to me is good enough. Except, in Noida, we found that usually the perception in terms of comfort and convenience was positive. And even the service quality perception for the locally manufactured modes that I just talked about was pretty high. In terms of affordability, again, we got a very positive perception that, people indicating that they are comfortable paying the current levels of fare that are being charged by these modes. And they find these modes to be quite affordable. Again, Noida came out to be an exception in this case as well. And then these were just the motorized modes. We also studied the operational characteristics of the non-motorized modes that are operating in the cities. So in this case, what we found in the case of cycle rickshaws is neither the routes or the zone of operations were defined as in the case of, say, the shared auto rickshaws and the Tata Magics and Geos. There was no permit, no licensing, no driver registration, no PSV stand. They would typically operate from a stand, and usually an informal driver groups would come together and follow a queue system. That's the kind of scheduling that they would follow. And the unions are typically weak as compared to their motorized counterparts. They would typically cover distances of 2 to 3 kilometers and undertake 10 to 12 trips per day. And costs involved usually are minuscule, and they're largely operating on a rental basis, where cycle rickshaws are being rented by people who own a fleet of cycle rickshaws. And the rent varies from 30 to 50 rupees in all the cities that we studied per day rent. And they would typically end up earning 200 to 300 rupees. So this is essentially, what we captured from these modes. And then,
Ashima, try to finish.
Yeah, I'll just take 2 more minutes. And then, as you were saying that there are certain perceived issues with regard to these modes, there is a kind of a biased view that these modes create congestion and all. So that also we tried to, do surveys to kind of understand whether these common perceptions are true or not. So one of the things related to these modes is that, are these modes safe? So we carried out, these are largely retrofitted vehicles, which is essentially a compromise on safety of the passengers. And most of these retrofitted vehicles are not type approved. And overloading is a kind of common issue. And we can see that in terms of seating capacity versus really what the number of passengers that are being carried. And these are the kind of vehicles really you can see which are being used. So from a vehicle safety perspective, it's really a kind of a question mark. However, when we talk to the users of these modes, they find these modes to be pretty safe and secure. Again, I would point that to, one, maybe that is so, or there is lack of choice. So whatever is available is good enough. And then we also try to understand another common perception with regard to these modes, that they are not clean. That is, they use adulterated fuel and all. So that was studied, and what we found is that they're largely following the regulations. They're running on CNG and LPG, though there are cases of fuel adulteration wherever diesel is being used. And typically in the urban areas, the fleet is not that old. However, as we go in the peripheral areas, that is where we find more old fleet, because regulations, there is not much of enforcement, so you can actually apply an old vehicle there. So, and then we got really the data on fuel efficiency and fleet age. And what essentially was coming out is that the fuel efficiency of the older fleet was lower, and fuel adulteration was a problem. And when we come to looking at it, their emission profile, then definitely most of them were not following the PUC certificates, which kind of indicates that maybe emissions is an issue as far as these modes are concerned. So, and just quickly touch upon, do these modes comply with regulations? Driver licenses. Only in the case of, locally manufactured vehicles that we found there was no driving licenses. Otherwise, usually the drivers of these modes would have a driving license. These vehicles would have a vehicle registration, except again in the case of peri-urban areas or the locally manufactured modes. So then, therefore, we kind of, I've not kind of summarized it very briefly here, but we've suggested very detailed recommendation to different committees and ministries about, whether there is one need to regulate these modes. If yes, to what extent? Because there is a certain characteristic of these modes which really which makes it possible for them to serve people in an operationally profitable manner, which is why they continue to provide those services to us. So if we kind of tamper a lot with that, they may not end up providing those services to us. So there are suggestions about integrating them, rather than being a competition to formal services that are introduced in the cities, they can actually complement the formal services. There is definitely need to enforce, strengthening the enforcement. For example, there's a lot of non-compliance, those issues can be addressed. Fares, we felt, should not be regulated. They should always be left to the market. And that's why, we also see that most of the commuters find them to be affordable. And so, yeah, largely these are some of the recommendations that we provided. So I can just leave the slide open for you. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Yeah, thanks.